Hey there, this is Natalie, and I wanted to revisit a video I made back in the summer about the debate around whether Felix Argyle from ReZero is written as a trans woman or not. I won't go over everything in that video, I'll link to it in a pinned comment if you want to check it out, but my main point was that canonically Felix is male, and says he's male, so while viewing him as trans as a headcanon is completely fine, if it makes you enjoy the character more, it doesn't seem like this was intended to be ambiguous. I also said that if Felix was a trans woman, he might not be taken as good representation, due to the fact he started dressing as a woman for someone else, that's Crush, and it's described in the X1 prequel novel. Plus, he enjoys the effect finding out he's male has on straight men, who are attracted to him in his female clothes. However, as I also said in that video, I'm not trans, and I wasn't really trying to speak for anybody, just to look at the writing and what I think the author was trying to do with the character of Felix. But I got some really interesting comments in DMs as a result of that video, with people arguing the case that Felix can be read as being intended to be canonically trans, and that rather than the things I used as evidence he's a cross-dressing man rather than a trans woman, meaning something about him, they're actually more about the setting and society ReZero takes place in. Personally, I do still see Felix as a cross-dressing man, but there are some persuasive arguments that it's not quite as clear-cut as I said in my last video. And since I thought some of the things commenters said were pretty interesting, I thought I'd revisit the topic with some of the arguments for Felix being a trans woman, who just doesn't really know that that's a thing because of the societal norms of the setting. Before I go into all of that though, I do want to say that this is all just for the purposes of analysing ReZero, Tappei's writing, and the character of Felix. This isn't supposed to be anything political or particularly opinionated. I just felt like after reading the comments over time, there was another side to this topic that was interesting to talk about. And as with my last Felix video, Felix will be represented by random cats once again, as I'm hoping to avoid the wrath of Kadokawa, who like to indiscriminately copyright strike AniTubers for ReZero content, for reasons known only to themselves. So, let's take a look at some of the cases for Felix Argyle being not only trans, but actually good trans representation. Some of the comments I'll be talking about are from trans people, so on the representation matter, they're going to have a better idea. I was thinking about it as a writer rather than someone that the representation would actually apply to. However, obviously trans people, like any community, aren't a monolith, and so while people who watch my channel and like ReZero may see Felix, a character they like, as representation they want, this won't necessarily mean that there wouldn't be people who dislike Felix as fictional representation of a trans woman, for the reasons I put forward in the other video. I do still personally think that if the intention was for Ferry-chan to be a trans woman, the character would have been written a bit differently to avoid that. Perhaps Crush giving Felix the confidence to adopt a new feminine persona that Felix had always wanted, rather than Felix taking it on as a way to help her. And with Felix never outright telling people about his male body. But it is good to know that people who do see strong parallels between Felix and a trans woman who isn't able to fully live as a woman due to the society around them, still think Tappei has done a good job of representing this. So, the first comment I want to talk about is this one from Theme Song Fan, which says, "I've read ReZero X1 and you make several good points. However, I personally think the situation is more grey than that you're not wrong, but you're not right either. You mentioned that Ferris corrects people who get his gender wrong, for example, but to the best of my memory, that really only happened one time, and only because he'd been called out, not because he wanted to. I also don't recall there being any time Ferris ever referred to himself as Felix, save perhaps when introducing himself to his father, while I can by contrast remember many times he complained about someone else using that name. It is true that he doesn't bat an eye to people referring to him as a man, and does get a kick out of people discovering that he has man parts, but I've also seen examples of him intentionally trying to keep people from hearing this, such as in the Prophecy of the Throne Switch game, where Subaru remains completely unaware all throughout, partly because Ferris shushed the other knights before they could say anything. There are also clear examples of Ferris wishing he could be a woman in ReZero X1. The girlishness was borrowed, though it ought to have belonged to this person to begin with, so it was important to treat it carefully. Rather than say definitively that Ferris is or isn't trans, I believe it's most accurate to say that he would be if he lived in a society that was accepting of it, but he doesn't, and therefore doesn't quite cross that line. The proof of the fact that this society does not accept transgenderism as a real thing can be seen in ReZero X2, where a character who actually is trans can be clearly seen, Libre Fermi, the strongest warrior of the demon-human alliance, very clearly and consistently claimed to be a woman, but was nevertheless referred to as male by every other character as well as the author. So saying a character in ReZero is clearly portrayed as such and such is, in my opinion, erroneous. It is considered common sense in this world that you are the gender you were born as, and that's the sort of society Ferris grew up in. So that's what this world portrays him as, just as it did with Libre Fermi. So even if Ferris wanted to be a woman, which I believe he does, it wouldn't be as simple as declaring himself to be one. As a result, he exists in this middle ground state where it's difficult, from our perspective, to identify him as anything. He does playfully mention that he never claimed to be female several times, but again, he also never claims to be male, outside of Giguk videos, because I believe that he doesn't feel like he rightly falls into either category. He cannot think of himself as a man, yet the world insists that he is one. Now, there are a few interesting things in this comment. I haven't played Prophecy of the Throne yet, so I don't know the scene they're referring to, but while a lot of people didn't like the game that much, it was overseen by Tappei, which means that while it isn't canon, it should be compatible with the canon, and therefore nobody should be doing anything out of character. That means this does show an example of Ferry-chan acting like he'd rather people didn't know he was male. The points about Libre Fermi were ones I admit I'd never really considered. I think because this character is a snake human, and so I thought that maybe they had some weird biology that other people just didn't get, rather than them being trans. Snakes do have binary male and female biology, but it's a bit different from in mammals, and I don't think Tappei is the sort of writer who really likes to explore things like what sort of genitalia and reproductive cycles beast people have, so I think that just kind of went over my head, but it is a good point. However, when they say that the author refers to Libre Fermi as male, that may be a translation thing. I don't know if the commenter speaks Japanese, and I don't speak it well enough to check, but in general it's much easier to write without using gendered pronouns in Japanese, because pronouns just aren't used as much in Japanese sentence structure. They're often omitted if it's obvious from the rest of the sentence who you're talking about, and names are used in place of pronouns far more often than in English too, even in place of the pronoun you most of the time. When you translate Japanese to English, you generally have to add pronouns in, and so use of male language for Libre may have been a choice of the translator rather than of Tappei. There are other characters that this has proven an issue for translators in the past, such as Hanji in Attack on Titan, whose gender was never really clear until the anime, and every gem character in Hoseki no Kuni or Land of the Lustrous, because they're all genderless mineral people. Speaking of genderless mineral people, ReZero actually has those too, in the form of the Steel Folk. We encounter one of these characters in X4, and they're likely to come up again in Arc 7, but for this character, and I won't spoil anything about them, the translators at Yen Press opted for they pronouns, so who can really say whether the translator who worked on X2, where Libre Fermi appeared, thought about this or not, if Libre's gender wasn't clear from the Japanese. I think though that I can agree that there is an argument there that the society in Lagunica at least doesn't really have the concept of trans people, or at least we never see anything that supports that they do. It's possible that other countries in the setting may be different in that respect. Wallachia, for instance, doesn't seem to really have any prejudices about non-human races, and only cares if people are strong or not. So it seems plausible that there they wouldn't care how somebody wants to live their life or be addressed gender-wise either. We do know though, from things I won't spoil involving Subaru cross-dressing, that a cross-dressing man isn't something that especially shocks people in ReZero's world. So it's certainly reasonable to put forward that Felix in our world would transition, but in the society he lives in, that's either not a concept that exists, or one that would lead to him being ostracised. This would make cross-dressing and appearing as a woman with a cute nickname the closest thing he can conceive of to actually living as a woman, and would effectively mean Felix was written as trans. The next comment I want to look at talks about a slightly different idea, that Felix is a trans woman but in a more embryonic experimental phase, rather than having fully accepted this yet. Commenter Day Ward says, I think it's important to note that there's something people like to talk about: eggs. Trans people usually take a while to understand themselves, and there's a stage before they come out to themselves as trans. A symptom of this can often be, say, cross-dressing, and still calling yourself a man. Not that cross-dressing immediately makes you female, it's just that when I look back onto myself, I see that my favourite photos when I didn't know I was trans were when I was cross-dressing. I had dreams of transforming into others. A lot of my earlier crushes were on girls I was jealous of and wanted to look like. So it's quite likely that trans people see a bit of themselves in this character, just from when they themselves were first trying out things, before acknowledging that they are trans. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only trans experience, just that a lot of trans girls' life cycles, there was a stage when they thought of themselves as just an effeminate boy who totally could not be a girl. Good video though. Well, thank you for the compliment at the end there, Dayward. And honestly, this concept could be applied to Felix pretty easily. He is quite young, being 19 at the start of the series, and it could be said that part of his admiration of Crush could be him seeing something in her that he'd like to have for himself. Conveniently, that part being the part she wanted to suppress, her femininity. What's interesting here is that if this idea is actually what Tappé had in mind when he was creating Felix, we might actually see him move more towards a fully female identity as the series goes on. I'm not sure that that sort of character arc would be something Tappé would typically do, but it's an interesting idea to think about. However, on the subject of eggs, which was a term I'd admittedly never heard before, another commenter, Charlie Khan, also said this: I honestly don't care. As long as someone doesn't act as if their interpretation is the only acceptable interpretation, they can get whatever they want out of a story. However, I do myself believe that the idea that anybody who doesn't abide by their gender norm is inherently an egg, to be harmful to feminist theory, creative cis people, and in fact the trans community at large, especially the non-binary community. For one thing, presuming another's identity without the input of said other goes against the essential principles of all of these communities, such as self-determination, independence, and individual power. For another thing, it furthers the stereotype of authoritarianism in these communities. Granted, I'm cis, straight, most likely, and male, so I cannot speak for what others might think on account of my lack of experience, but my opinion is still my opinion, and I wish to express it freely. Now, I can see his point here too, so to me it's really just down to how Tappé wants Felix to be as a character he created. He could be, as Dayward says, a trans person still in the process of discovering himself, or he could be a gender non-conforming man. I personally think he's the latter, which is why I made the first video, but again, all this stuff does make it seem less cut and dried than I originally saw it, and like there are other possibilities when it comes to how Tappé will develop Felix in the future. For another view, there's this comment by Masked Man Feligator Man, and he says, I usually hate this discussion because the ReZero community is quite reductive and almost vitriolic when a genuine discussion about the work like this is brought up. The usually gimmick accounts who say that Ferris is trans usually don't help either, with accusations of transphobia on the community and Tappé's side too. I think it's pretty explicit that Ferris is coded to be gender non-conforming, but I don't think he's trans. Though I don't think he's just cis either. It's possible for Felix to be dysmorphic and identify socially feminine without outright objecting to his biological sex and the gender he was assigned. It's more complicated than just the two big cis and trans bubbles a lot of members of the community see it as. Tappé clearly respects that Felix's identity is complex and not really easily definable, even if he won't budge on his actual gender/sex. Explicitly transphobic characters like Capella are very obviously painted as terrible for the things they do. Either way, Ferris is an extremely good representation of gender non-conformity, trans or not. He's far more than just a gimmick, like a lot of similar characters in other pieces of media. So while Ferris is obviously comfortable with his body and male pronouns, I think the trans coding is there, and it's an interpretation that's not that harmful or even surprising. Like how, in an unrelated form, but written in a similar way, Otto is coded to be neurodivergent. Well, much as the word coding gives me painful flashbacks to a certain video about Dragon Maid, I think he's right, and I'm using he pronouns for this commenter because he has man in his screen name twice, which I'm taking as a clue. This to me is probably the interpretation that feels the most right, out of the ones I've talked about here, and I think was kind of how I always interpreted Felix, but I perhaps went too far into looking at it as though he had to be provably either a trans woman or a man in the canon to settle the argument when I was making the last video. Now, there are a lot more comments that cover both sides of the conversation and many positions in between, so if you're interested, check out the comment section of the video in my pinned comment, but I'd be really interested to know what you think about the points raised here, so let me know in the comments for this video. Thanks as always to my supporters on Patreon, and to those of you who help me out by subscribing to my channel and leaving likes and comments on my videos. I've just started adding Mushoku Tensei analysis to my content, so be sure to check out my most recent video about Roxy if you're a fan of that series, and subscribe for more of that, as well as of course more ReZero and general anime content in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.